let us begin as we did last week with a short, well, we call it meditation, basically a technique to settle down our mind a bit. With, I guess your day is starting. I've had already quite a full-on day, but regardless, we've all had busy lives, so our minds are naturally distracted with so many things. So in order to make our time together, a session, most productive or meaningful, it would be good to really start with just settling down our mind a bit. So whatever posture you're comfortable in, traditionally, of course, with the meditation posture, they say that it's good to have one's back spine straight, if that is possible. It helps the energy to flow well in our body, makes the mind a little bit fresher. And in our tradition, for meditation posture, it is not suggested to have the eyes completely closed, as for longer meditation that can bring on onset of darkness and even possibly sleep. So the eyes are just slightly open. So there's some visibility of light, but we're not focusing on anything external. So it's as if we're gazing straight ahead, but just with the eyelids slightly open. And so here we just begin by being aware of our immediate surrounding to begin with. We're all, no doubt, in a relatively quiet, definitely a safe environment, and a quiet. And every environment, every place where there's some sort of keen interest in one's inner search, spiritual development, is also a sacred place. So we are definitely in a sacred place. So as we start becoming aware of our immediate environment and the conducive environment we're in, we can also take a moment to really acknowledge that we are so fortunate to have this time and space. At this very moment, there's so many who are completely caught in a very chaotic, even conflict sort of place where there's no opportunity to even sit down quietly. So taking a moment to just feel that gratitude of having this opportunity. As I recall, one Benedictine elder Christian monk, when he was giving a talk about happiness, he said, one of the main keys to happiness is feeling gratitude. And it seems so true. And then now we can bring awareness slowly and gradually to our physical presence here in this moment. And as we acknowledge our physical body, we can also take a moment to feel a great sense of gratitude and acknowledging that we're so fortunate in having this present body that we have, which is a human body. But according to our tradition, when we have a human body which has its sense faculties on intact, we have intelligence, we have a mind that is able to think clearly and analyze things. And particularly when there's an interest in the spiritual development, in this case, the Buddhist teachings, then it's definitely what we call a precious human life. So we can again feel a sense of gratitude of having this incredible condition of having a precious human life. And now we can bring our awareness slowly and gradually to bringing it more inward. So bringing it now to our breath. One of the most intimate sort of parts of ourselves, or that what keeps us functioning, is our breath. And we breathe every moment of our life, but we hardly are aware or think about our breath. So here we're giving ourselves time to really just bring awareness simply on observing our breath. So here, preferably, we're breathing in very naturally, without any labor, very gently. As we breathe into our nostrils, just mentally following the breath going in through the nostrils. And as we breathe out, just mentally following the breath coming out. And just allowing one's mind to just be rest on one's breath. Giving oneself this, again, taking the full opportunity of giving ourselves a true break from all the, all the chaotic sort of and distracted sort of thoughts in the mind. We're not able to stop our thoughts, but here the difference would be that we are going to choose not to follow our thoughts. It requires a little bit of a discipline and a decision, commitment to ourselves. For the next 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to just place my focus on my breath. So with that, we can now just go into this focused meditation for a few moments, just observing our breath. So within even these few moments, we can not notice that just by the fact of deciding to focus on our breath, simply just doing that, we notice that our mind does settle down. And so we're getting a glimpse into what is said to be the ultimate state of our mind, which is a tranquil, clear, and peaceful state of mind. So definitely our mind is now in a relatively more settled and clear state. So we use this clear state of mind, which is most probably a neutral state of mind right now, to actually intentionally generate a positive state of mind to secure and ensure that our time together becomes most meaningful. So we set our what is called a motivation for our session this morning. That may every minute and second that I spend here today, this morning, all the energy and time I spent, may it actually become a cause for me to develop better understanding of myself, more being able to gain more insight into reality of my situation. And in that way, with a genuine understanding of oneself and acceptance of oneself, one can then be more equipped, more keen to know what is really most beneficial for oneself and what is harmful to oneself. And when we have that clear understanding in relation to ourselves, we'll be then naturally equipped to be able to assist others and help others who also want to find out more about reality. So ultimately, if our actions and deeds together today can become a cause for our ultimate enlightenment, which is said to be possible. As the Buddha had said, we all possess what is called Buddha nature, the potential to become enlightened. So that is being activated right now, and made through this activation of our Buddha potential, enlightenment, where we actually achieve that state so we can benefit all beings. So we can now gradually, just slowly come off the focus of our breath and our motivation, and just be aware again of our physical presence here. And as we gradually open our eyes wider, we become aware of the immediate surrounding, and coming back to the outside external reality. And so, last week, I think there might be some new people who are joining here, but since I see a few familiar faces from our last session from last week, it is good to do a small review of what we did last week, but I'm going to ask the help of some who had joined last week to see if you can recall some points. I think I did mention many things I recall, and trying to give a premises, trying to sort of like lay out the premises or the basis for the material that we're covering. I might have given maybe a little bit too much for you to be able to handle at one time. But nevertheless, if someone can help me, if you can remember the quote I used from a famous artist, painter, that I was saying that quote actually summarizes the real essential points of Buddhism as well when we paraphrase that quote. Can anyone remember that quote, who the artist was to begin with? Yeah, please, you can share that.
I remember the artist was Pablo Picasso.
Picasso, that's right. Do you remember the quote? Anyone?
I'm working on it.
Someone else might be able to recall, remember their quotes. I think it's very significant. That's why I'm sort of like probing.
It was about the meaning and purpose of life.
That's correct. We're getting closer.
And you paraphrase the meaning. I guess. Oh shoot! I'm having trouble. The purpose of life is to share your blessing with others. Meaning of life to find it, or something like that.
Okay. Well, so just that we get the record straight about the actual quote. So Pablo Picasso, his actual quote, as I read it, is the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it to others. So that's what Pablo Picasso had mentioned. The meaning of life is to find your gift. And of course, we all know what his gift was. And as he said, the purpose of life is to give it to others. And we all know now, the reason why we know even his name, Pablo Picasso, is because he actually gave his gift to others in his art, right? Which we can see to this day. So I think this quote from Pablo Picasso is like so, when it's paraphrased, it fits so well in the Buddhist context. So the Buddhist version of that would be, the meaning of life is to find happiness within oneself, to find happiness within oneself. And I emphasize within oneself because, as we will learn through the teachings, we've been constantly searching outward for happiness, but it's not out there. We have to find it within ourselves. So again, to paraphrase that quote, the meaning of life is to find happiness within, and the purpose of life is to give it to others, to share it with others. So, and thus, I really do feel that this quote actually does summarize the main points in the Buddhist teachings. Like in Buddhism, as I was sharing last week, we have like two main paths. One that leads to what we call self-liberation, which is happiness, primarily seeking happiness for one's own sake, to reach a state of peace and happiness within oneself, primarily. Whereas there's another path we follow in Buddhism, which is in our tradition, is that we're seeking, as we seek happiness within, we are specifically seeking happiness so that we can bring that happiness and alleviate the suffering of others, of all other beings. And this is what we call in our tradition the great vehicles path, or the Mahayana path. So the teachings that we are covering here would be from mainly coming from that tradition of how we could possibly start to begin to think in how to bring happiness to others. And even in the great vehicles tradition, what we call the great vehicles tradition, which is seeking to develop love and compassion and what is called bodhicitta as a way to benefit all beings, we need to first do the work on ourselves. We need to as the teachings say, we need to first subdue our own mind, our own crazy mind, before we can even begin to actually help other beings, help others. So here, these verses that we are covering in our sessions here are verses which are primarily primary trainings of mind, of how to actually train your mind to be able to actually assist others and help others, but by actually practicing some sort of shift of attitudes, ways of changing one's attitude within oneself first. So these, as we go through these teachings, they may seem a little bit far-fetched and like a little bit too much to ask, especially when we go further into the verses. We might like some of these practices may seem, but it is, for someone, of course, these are in actual practice, when it is done in an actual full context practice itself, it is meant to be for those who have already developed their mind to a higher level and are able to really, who have already done some ground training, some basic training already, and have now reached a level where they are very determined. They're called those who are inclined to follow the bodhisattva ideal, the bodhisattva path, which is a being who has developed a great altruistic wish to benefit all beings. So for such beings with such commitment to benefit others, they will take upon themselves anything that is necessary, any practice, anything that is required to be able to assist others, benefit others, and if it means to change your attitude radically and to completely, how should we say, basically change one's attitude radically. We're also used to certain patterns of ways of thinking and reacting because of our attitudes and ways that we are so familiarized, so habituated in thinking. We react. Our reactions are like a product of our thinking. Basically, all our actions are verbal. When we say actions, it sounds more active, more. Of course, in Buddhism, we say that even thinking is an action. That's an action of the mind. But here, when we say action, like physical and verbal actions, that's a physical and verbal karma in Buddhism, that is followed by our thoughts. So whatever we think in our mind is what initiates our speech and our physical actions. So the training thus really begins in our mind, and training our mind. And then when there's a shift of attitude in our mind, naturally, our physical and verbal mannerisms will also change as well, change to become more productive, more beneficial rather than harmful. And the key thing here is that although it may sound like and seem like we're doing this to benefit other sentient beings, which is the attitude one has to develop, and it is with that intention to help other beings. But what we begin to notice is that even beginning to try to practice this and try to really take it on board, the real immediate beneficiary is oneself. It really helps oneself to begin with. And as we are benefited, as we get more benefit from these practices and trainings, we then naturally become happier, and then we are naturally more capable to be able to help others when we are in a happy and more controlled, more content state of mind. Does it all make sense so far? Yeah. Okay. Because I don't want to go on rambling along. If you said something doesn't, like some doesn't resonate, or if something doesn't make sense right away, then there's no point going on. So, but I like my sessions to be interactive. So if any time you do want to clarify something, or you feel like, oh, I just want to clarify that, and I might lose lose that trend of the thought or something, then you just raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and we can discuss it. Although I will leave time for questions a little later on. So on that premises, on the basis that one really wishes to take one's practice further, so that one can take into consideration others' needs as well. So these teachings are really based on taking others into consideration versus the primary focus just being oneself. And according to the Buddhist teachings of the mind, it is really that self-centered mind which actually is the cause for all our problems that we are facing, and all the mistakes we've made, and all the predicaments we get into ourselves into is because of that very strong self-centered mind. So these teachings here are, if that can, of course, it will take a really long while, and I can say this for myself, after so many years of teachings, it's just beginning to just slowly sink in that reality and truth about that self-centeredness being the primary cause of all our problems. And I say that it is difficult because, being an ordinary human being myself, I think we ordinary beings are just so conditioned in finding the blame outside. When something doesn't work to our liking, when something goes wrong, there's immediately the mind seems to be immediately finding something to blame, something else, something out there. And I think a very key important point here, which I'll mention right from the beginning, because this is where I find that myself, including, misinterpreted what that means. When the Buddhist teachings say that the self-centered mind is the root of all our problems, if that is not understood in its proper context, in its actual context, it may actually sound as if that one is to be blamed, that one is the cause of one's own problems. And I remember when I started hearing about this, the shortcomings of self-centeredness, and the problems, all the problems are caused from self-centeredness, I started becoming a little bit defensive against those teachings. I felt like, I don't know if that's all right. Don't we need some sort of self-centeredness a bit? And that is said to be, we feel that way because we have been so habituated, so ingrained with that self-centeredness as being our actual identity. We associate this state of mind called self-centeredness, or self-cherishing in other translations, as our identity. We think that if we don't focus on ourselves, then, that self-centeredness starts from a misconception of who the self is. So that's the point. And it is that misconception of the self that produces that notion of that one has to focus on oneself, completely absorbed just on oneself. And so no wonder we have that self-centered mind, and we think that that's who we, that's our part of identity, because we're actually holding on to a false identity to begin with. And it will take much more further explanation of what it means to hold on to a false identity, a false sense of self, and what is the correct, is there a self or not? Those are more deeper levels of discussion, which we might have some time later on to discuss at the end of these towards the end of these teachings, which are the relevant points. But again, it would not be able to really get the full extent in just a few words anyway. But just for now, if one can, just as a way to start to opening your perception of things here from the Buddhist point of view, is that it is definitely presented in the Buddhist psychology or Buddhist teachings that all our problems really start from that false identity we have of ourselves, a false identity. And that false identity of ourselves actually then produces, as a byproduct, self-centered attitude. And because we've been holding on to this false identity and the byproduct, which is a self-centered attitude in relation to that, we just naturally tend to believe that that is our identity. And so when self-centeredness is criticized, how should you say, when it is pointed out that self-centeredness is the problem, we feel that, oh, I'm the problem. I'm being blamed. And so it is hard for us right now to separate the self-centered attitude and associate that with the false identity we have ourselves and the true selves, what the true self is, what the actual self is. It is now completely integrated so deeply that we feel that when the self-centered attitude or the false identity is being pointed out as a mistake, we think that I'm being accused, I'm being criticized. And I think this is a very important point right from the beginning, so that we don't misinterpret the teachings. When the fault of self-cherishing is being pointed out, it is not suggesting that we are at fault. We are a victim. We are a victim of our own self-centered mind. But because this self-centered mind, which comes from a false entity, was created by none other than what is called in Buddhism ignorance, which is within ourselves, the only way to be free of that, the opposer, what's the word for one is a victim, the other is what? A perpetrator. The perpetrator for all our problems is a self-centered mind, and we, the true selves, is actually the victim. But it's become so integrated in one within ourselves that it's hard for us to really make that distinction. And the whole point of reading the teachings is slowly and gradually to be able to realize that these are two separate things. The false identity we hold to ourselves, which is technically called a grasping to the self. The grasping to the self is false, holding on to the false identity, which then produces that self-centeredness, is something which can be separated, which can be actually eliminated. And so when the self-centered mind, as it starts to get eliminated, slowly, gradually decrease, in place, instead of the self-centered mind, what will start to develop apparently is a mind which is focused more on others' well-beings, taking others into consideration. And so we can use many examples here of how when relationships go sour and when things don't work out between any kind of relationship, parents and children, couples, and all of that, it's because, the stronger that sense of self-centeredness, you accuse me of that, and we associate ourselves with that self-centered mind. Is actually, we didn't get what we wanted, what we believed was good for us. And then that's why we have the conflicts, all of that arises. So with that on the premises of the basis of that, the main point here I'm trying to emphasize is that all of these verses are trainings in trying to overcome, when one gets to see that mind that focuses just on one's own personal needs, just on oneself, and grasping onto oneself is a faulty mind, then how to overcome that. And then when we take ourselves into more importance than others, then that is the yet other byproducts of the self-centered mind. Actually, in Buddhism, we talk about when it expanded, they said there can be 84,000 different types of afflictions in our minds. There's not necessarily one person has them, but combinedly we can have about over 84,000 afflictions. They actually can be then more summarized into 6 primary afflictions and 20 associated afflictions. Then those 6 primary afflictions are actually the main ones, which are then those can be all combined into 3 main afflictions or 3 negative minds, which are basically anger, attachment, or desire. That has to be explained further. And then ignorance, which is the basis of all of these. Then on top of these 3, then we have got pride and deluded doubt, or obscured, distorted doubt, we can say, and distorted views. So these 6 then become the 6 root afflictions, which then cause all of our, how should we say, which are the sources of all the other problems we experience in life. And these six root afflictions are stemmed on ignorance, which that base ignorance is the distorted view that of holding on to a false identity, grasping to a non-existent self, a self which does not exist, but grasping onto that. So this all starts from there. So this is the premises, the basis. So of course, to unravel all of that, we need to sort of slowly work on each of these afflictions and how to overcome, how to counteract them, and slowly, like peeling an onion, coming to the very root of the onion, slowly peeling it away. So in last week, we covered 2 verses. The first verse, which was in relation to holding others more dear than oneself, holding other beings. I think the text is being shared by the host. So we covered the first 2 verses last week, which reads, with the determination to accomplish the highest welfare for all sentient beings who excel even the wish-granting jewel, may I at all times hold them dear. So we did cover a bit about that, about recognizing, when we recognize that other beings are, sentient beings are actually really precious. They're precious, more precious than even one of the greatest, most expensive and most prized jewels in this world, because it is in relation to sentient beings that one can train one's mind so that one can achieve one's own highest goals of liberation and enlightenment. But then again, it is sort of, you're holding others dear so that you are inclined to assist others. If you didn't hold others dear, if you didn't hold others precious, then there would be no interest from your side to wanting to extend yourself to help them, right? And even in our worldly existence, we don't have much hesitation to help someone that we consider dear, whereas we have reservations against those who are maybe strangers. We don't immediately we take a little bit caution when it comes to strangers, even in distress. Sometimes we might help them, but sometimes we're not too sure about how will be received well or not, or if they want to help or not. So, there's a reservation towards that. But we definitely have reservations to helping the perceived enemy, someone who is disagreeable. Yeah. So here, the training begins, the very first verse here begins with training our mind in seeing that all beings, regardless of who they are, so we're removing that categories of friends, enemies, and strangers, and really beginning to see that all beings are equally precious. And so that is to develop that attitude, and then that's when we can see other beings as being precious. We can hold them very dear. Then the next verse is that when you do sincerely, when we have trained our mind to a point where we can sincerely hold others as being very precious and dear, then the next verse becomes more, how should we say, seems like something that we would more likely practice, which is, whenever I associate with others, may I think myself as lowest of all, and from the depth of my heart hold others supreme. So here, this verse, particularly within the 6 primary or 6 main afflictions, is particularly a training of the mind to try to, in working to overcome a sense of pride, sense of superiority. That sense of pride or superiority is where we see others as being lower than ourselves. Again, the stronger sense of self-centeredness we may have, the greater the pride it produces within oneself. And so therefore, the reason why we have great beings like the Dalai Lama bowing down to everyone and really paying respect to just everyone around is because they have overcome their sense of self-superiority, that self-centered mind. And so if we're inspired to be like these great beings who really respect and, naturally hold others dear, then this is the training, that we begin with the training of really beginning to train our mind in actually, if not possible in actual practice yet, then at least in our meditation. In meditation, we can afford to lessen down our pride a bit and be a little bit humble, because usually we hold on to a sense of pride because we think, well, if I don't help myself as being more important, others will take advantage of me. They will crush me and so forth. So we have that sense of wanting to protect ourselves. But again, that protection is all based on that false notion of who we are, that grasping to the self, the self-centeredness. That is producing that false sense of needing of security. And so here in the training of our mind, in meditation, we begin to practice with meditation where we genuinely and sincerely start to hold others as being dear. As the Dalai Lama clarifies with this verse, he says, that doesn't mean that one allows others to take advantage of what in actual everyday life, that one should just like be a doormat and just allow others to take advantage and hurt us and so forth. Or, that is not the point. If others are, unreasonably, stepping over boundaries and hurting us, in order to protect oneself and them, the Dalai Lama says we can train our mind that without anger, without hatred and anger in our mind, we can let them know that what they're doing is not correct, it's not acceptable, and we can put our boundaries in a reasonable way without the sense of having to be hostile, being without anger, in a meaningful way. It may sound too good to be true, but if it is true, if it is possible, then why not? If we can solve any issue, any problem without the sense of aggression and hostility, then wouldn't that be a better option? Wouldn't we agree with that? So these teachings are saying that basically it is possible, but it begins with training our minds, changing our attitude. So now we go to the third verse, otherwise we'll completely run out of time again. So as it reads here in our third verse, in all actions may I examine my mind, and as soon as delusions arise, endangering myself and others, may I firmly face and avert them. So in all actions refers to any actions we do, physically and verbally. Specifically, here are the more exterior actions that we engage in. It's more in like actions that in where we encounter others, with others. So in all actions, that whatever activity we do, it is suggesting that we first examine our mind, state of mind. And again, here, as you would recall right from the beginning, it was mentioned that all our activities, good or bad, positive or negative, what are the terms in Buddhism that we do use terms of positive, negative in Buddhism, it is all in relation to the experience we have. What is an uncomfortable experience is said to be a cause from a negative action, and the positive experiences we have, the more pleasant or positive, good experiences we have is produced from good action, positive action. So it's basically simple as that. So therefore, all actions are said to stem from our mind, starts from our mind. So therefore, in all actions relating to, more specifically in this case, external actions of our bodily actions and speech, may I first examine my mind, and as soon as delusions arise, and we already covered some of the delusions which were mentioned, the primary delusions, such as if there's attachment, strong attachment in my mind, if there's strong anger in my mind, if there's jealousy in my mind, or if there's strong pride, or if there's doubts, and I'm not too sure about it. Sometimes we come across to others as being very assertive, it is kind of like really fascinating to think that how we share what we think are facts by just hearing it from somewhere else. We go around telling the news and as if it's facts, as we hardly know. We just heard it, and we just have to assume that what we're sharing is just actual facts, but really, honestly, we've just heard it ourselves, isn't it? And of course, if we are quite sure about our sources where we heard it from, then we might feel more confidence. But sometimes we're overly assertive, when in fact, if we really question, we might have doubts ourselves. Yeah. So here it's saying that if we have a doubtful mind, then we can also be a little bit more careful in how we present ourselves. Then there's also distorted views, which is then, and that just has many more categories within that. So the primary ones are like strong anger and attachment. In our interactions with others, really the pitfalls is when either there's a strong attachment or anger, aversion. With strong attachment, we start to present, try to control the situation so that it's in our favor. We disregard the other's needs. If it's a person, we disregard their space, and we just become completely involved enveloped in how it'll be suitable to just me. And no wonder others feel that they're being taken advantage of and that their boundaries have been stepped over and so forth, when we have not paid attention to that. If our attachment was stronger, and I think attachment, well, not I think, it's a fact apparently as presented in the Buddhist psychology, but it's really true when we really honestly look at ourselves. They say that, the reason why relationships sometimes go wrong and there's conflict and so forth, when initially you thought there was love, and then we so often hear, but I love them dearly, of all that I've done for them, and I did truly love them. But according to the teachings, is it really true love, or was there more attachment involved there? Yeah. And so I think the problem we have is that we're not able to distinguish between attachment and love, and we confuse the two. And in a worldly sense, actually attachment is used as a synonym, or what's the word in English? As equivalent of love. Usually when basically when you sign letters off and saying, and when you say you're expressing your love to the other, it's basically mostly attachment. But because it's not seen, and initially you really are blinded to your own attachments, and you really truly do believe that you love the other person. It's only later when your expectations are not met and you get deeply hurt that you realize, perhaps it was attachment. One's own needs were not met, perhaps. So because we ourselves are hurt initially, and then we hurt others because we are hurt. And so therefore, because it causes hurt in oneself and others, pain and unnecessary complications, that's why it is suggesting here that we must be very careful that when any of the delusions arise, because it endangers myself and others, may I firmly face and avert them. Here means that may I recognize these afflictions for what they are and apply antidotes which could help to overcome them. Now, of course, the big question will arise, well, what are the antidotes, and are we able to really completely overcome them? That's, of course, as a beginner, on a beginner level, very difficult. The Buddhist teachings, of course, will require a little bit more readings, more study on other text sources, which do present antidotes for various different afflictions that arise in the mind. I think the very first step is to really recognize an affliction for what it is. For example, with anger, it's very tricky. Speaking for myself, whenever I feel like that my buttons are pushed and I feel like, I feel hurt in some way, of course I get upset. We have kinder words in English where we use upset or being annoyed, as if that is not anger, but according to Buddhism is, of course, it's a subtle level of anger, annoyance, being upset, even agitated. Slight agitation, which starts in our mind, is already a beginning of an anger. And in English word, anger sounds like has a full-blown rage, red face, and shouting. Then you say someone's angry. But if you're kind of like quiet and you don't show nothing, you don't say any facial expressions or verbal expressions yet, you might think, oh, I'm not angry. But according to Buddhist teachings, anger starts on a very subtle level. Of course, there are different levels, and we may not have control on the more subtle levels, but nevertheless, if we start to notice that anger is starting to rise, that very noticing is said to be, that's what I was trying to mention earlier, is that, especially if one feels one is wrongly accused, or one really is, for whatever reason, one feels defensive of something, when we get upset or angry, and if someone points it out to us and we actually become quite like, expressive verbally or physically, we always have ways to justify it. But they started it first, or they said this, unreasonable, and we always have justifications for how we feel, and we justify our anger. So according to the teachings, if we don't really take that step of really recognizing and acknowledging to ourselves that anger is the destructive emotion, it actually disturbs one's state of mind. If we don't acknowledge that, then that justification of anger will just, reinforce our tendency, our habits to becoming upset and angry. And what seems to be spontaneous, without any seemingly control from our own self, the reason why we find ourselves getting so upset for something, sometimes even something quite insignificant, but really getting so upset and angry for whatever situation may be, it seems like we have no control over it. According to the teachings, it is none other than because we have been so habituated. What is called in Buddhist psychology, imprints of anger are so deep-rooted. And it is because of the habituation of anger, and likewise attachment, desire, and jealousy, and other pride as well, then all of these delusions are so habituated in our mind that it seems almost natural. It seems like just spontaneous. It just seems natural. It seems as if we have no control over it. And what's more, it seems, and even this is why I think it's a little bit tricky when in the Western context, from Western psychology, I guess, or Western just general way of thinking, you often have these expressions of, oh, but we're just human. And of course, it is true. In many sense, we are just human. But I've always struggled with that phrase coming from a traditional Buddhist background. I always thought, well, if I get upset or annoyed with myself, or I'm criticizing myself or others, or feel unhappy, whatever, when people try to say, oh, but that's okay, you're just human after all, don't be too hard on yourself, I think, well, does that mean that then it's okay to have anger, to have these emotions, that I should do anything about it? It's very tricky. So actually, I don't know, some of you might have already come across this book and may even have access or have it yourself. One of the latest books by the Dalai Lama and late Desmond Tutu. No, not Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu, right? The Book of Joy. The Book of Joy. Have you heard of it? This very thing is brought up, and there were Desmond Tutu. There we go. Someone's even got it. Great. I was gifted with this book when I was visiting my mom recently, which was such a savior, such a great thing, because when things get a little bit too heated, whatever, I just retired to my room and I started reading a few pages of this book. And as you would have noticed, for those who have the book, one of the key things which seemed to be a little bit of like a contradictory was where Desmond Tutu would bring up this Western way of presenting things of, oh, well, when things are a little bit difficult, too hard, but that's okay, we're just being human. We just have to accept our humanity. Whereas the Dalai Lama emphasizes developing what he calls mental immunity. Mental immunity. That's the phrase that he uses. And so the person who collaborated, interviewed, and put this book together said that what seemed to be a contradiction initially from Desmond Tutu and what the Lama was saying, actually, he says both, actually have their valid grounds. There's a meeting point in all of these. So, so these teachings are emphasizing really in developing a mental immunity, to being really aware, of these afflictions for what they are, destructive emotions. Another term for delusions or afflictions, there's many different translations, could be also destructive emotions. And that is a very, in fact, a very sort of vivid sort of description of these afflictions, destructive emotions. As soon as they arise, they actually disturb our mind. So, so therefore, here it is suggesting that once we really begin to recognize that these afflictions or delusions are actually they're actually destructive, they harm oneself and others, then when one begins to recognize them, then the initiative to avert them, meaning to overcome them. And there's different levels of overcoming them. Initially, just even recognizing them is a huge step, I believe. I mean, for me, that's where I am, just trying to even recognize them. When they come up very strongly, I forget to recognize them. It's only sometimes afterwards, after I've blurted out something or become really raged and all of that, that finally I think, oh yes, of course, I fell for it again, became a victim again. So really, we are a victim of our own afflictions in our mind, but we don't recognize them. We hold them as as the Dalai Lama mentions in his own teachings about these afflictions. One of the reasons we hold on to them is we think that they are protecting us. We think that attachment is necessary as a way to get things what we want, and anger is necessary because we want to. It is a mechanism to avoid things that we don't want. And I think from an evolution sort of description, they talk about the fight or flee sort of thing, this as like the human nature, fight or flee. I think that's more of an animalistic nature of ourselves, of humans, that we either have to fight, and of course fleeing is maybe a good thing. Maybe that's not something wrong in fleeing, but fighting is where we usually has that sense of aggression. We have to actually come back and overcome the other. So but I think we got the main point across, didn't we? That if we can begin to recognize what is the so-called afflictions for what they are, that they're actually destructive emotions. If we can actually recognize them as being destructive, then they're destructive, as mentioned here, for oneself, for one's own well-being, and then for the well-being of others as well. If one does truly dearly love others, then when one is upset and angry, one will far from being gentle and nice to the others that we love, we could start becoming abusive, becoming, actually start using abusive language, even physically abuse the other, and even to someone that we consider that we love, which in fact may have been more attachment to begin with, but nevertheless, we would say we love them, but yet we start hurting them. And then because we hurt them, we actually hurt ourselves too. So when we begin to recognize that pattern and see that pattern, that it arises from these afflictions, because of these afflictions, then the initiative to avert them, to be more mindful, to check one's mind, and to really check one's mind before one, acts it out, becomes an initiative that we might start to take more seriously. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. Okay. So then I will cover the next verse, and then we'll have time for questions. The fourth verse here then is, when I see beings of wicked nature, overwhelmed by violent non-virtue and afflictions, may I hold them dear, as if I found a rare and precious treasure. Now, as we see that the practices are starting to get more and more challenging, it's becoming more and more challenging. So here, in the third verse, it was more about ourselves, protecting our own mind, and making sure that examining our own mind and making sure that we are in control of our own mind and we're not falling victim to our own afflictions. So that is something we have control over. So that is exactly reasonably what is being suggested in the third verse. But here in the fourth verse, it is saying, well, how about when others are of wicked nature, when others are a little bit violent or doing things which are unreasonable, and when they are overwhelmed with afflictions? We can't impose control over. We can't impose others to control their mind. They have to come to their own understanding in terms of doing them themselves. So when others are like really wicked, that they're this is one again. This is the main source of the justification when we feel upset and angry about situation, is when others we feel are being completely unreasonable. They're like they're actually being, when of course when others are being violent in whatever form, it is not acceptable because it harms them and others. Of course, it is not acceptable. But here, if it is in a situation where we can't do anything about it, then getting upset and angry about the situation is not going to help change the situation in any way. And I don't know about yourselves, but my experience so far is that even when I feel like I've got something reasonable to say, when others are doing something unreasonable, if I'm trying to point out something to them, as soon as I get upset, it is not accepted by the other. It just completely, even if there was some basis to point out something reasonable, my being upset and angry has turned what otherwise may have been reasonable into something completely unreasonable. So it's not accepted by the other. Completely avoided. So it doesn't work. So the point really here is that it is not saying that it's okay for others who are doing violent and so forth, that what they're doing is fine, but it is saying that for our own practice, as a way to protect our own mind, if we can't change the other, then all we can do is change our own attitude, our own mind. So here it is saying that actually it is in relation to others who are really violent, who are wicked by nature, that we can develop a true sense of compassion. We don't need to extend our compassion and love and compassion to those who are everything's going well. And actually, normally in worldly situations, we find it hard to feel compassion for people who are rich and famous, right? We think like, oh, they've got it all. Why do I have to feel compassion for them? But according to Buddhist teachings, as we start to learn that actually they're experiencing a whole range of sufferings that may not be how should we say, apparent on the surface, but they're going through a whole range of other levels of sufferings themselves, then when we really understand that, we find room that they're actually to feel compassion for them too. And so here it is saying, it is for those that we understand who are going through difficulties, who are affected by. When we begin to really identify and recognize the afflictions as being harmful, as being destructive, then when others are affected by that, reasonably we should feel compassion for them, that they are suffering from their afflictions, from the disturbing, destructive emotions. So if then these other beings who are otherwise very violent and oppressed by their afflictions and destroying themselves and destroying others, when they become an object for our compassion, then in fact these beings become very dear because they're instilling a sentiment of love and compassion within us rather than hatred and anger. So in that way, they become very dear. It's like as you found a very precious mentioned here, like a precious treasure. Just as we would be so excited in finding a precious treasure when we see beings of wicked nature and so forth, when it becomes an object for our true love and compassion, for our understanding, then they're indeed like a precious treasure. When we understand, so this is really shifting our way of looking at things and understanding things. So does that make some sense though? So I think here we'll pause for, I've presented 2 verses, and we'll just leave some time for questions if you have any, or for clarifications, or even like if you want to share a comment on that.
Venerable Yeshe, Barbara has a question.
Sure. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable, for your teaching. I don't have a clear understanding of what deluded doubt means.
Okay. Sure. So it can sound a little bit technical here, but in the Buddhist psychology teachings of the mind in Buddhism, there's defined as 3 levels of doubts. Doubt is defined as being a state of mind which has qualms in 2 directions, not being sure. It could be either this or it could be that, right? So the deluded doubt is said to be the doubt one has on reality, which something which is true and in fact a reality, having 2 minds about it, where you're not too sure. So first of all, in doubt itself, there's 3 categories. Doubt leaning towards, so for whatever it may be, whatever it may be, let's take one example from this teachings itself. I'm sure by now everyone would have heard the term karma, right? Karma. So karma is basically the law of cause and effect. If you do good deeds, you get a good result. If you do bad deeds, you get a bad result. That's basically a simplified version of karma. Now, and according to the Buddhist teachings, karma is a reality. Karma is something which is true, which is a fact. It's just it's a natural law. So someone may have doubt about karma. They might come across the description of karma and think like, well, that doesn't, karma, this whole description of karma doesn't really make much sense at all. It could be true, but it's most likely that it's not true. So that doubt is in the first category, which is doubt leaning towards doubt which is leading towards, what's the opposite of a fact? What do you call it in English? So a fact would be like factual or something true, right? But when it's opposite of a fact, what's that?
Fiction.
Fiction. Well.
Untruth, lie.
Untruth. Okay, we can say untruth. Yeah. So there's doubt which leads to the untruth, doubt which is equal between the truth and untruth, and doubt leading more towards the truth. That's how I would put it. Yeah. So there's 3 levels of doubts: doubt which leans to the untruth, doubt which is like in between, and doubt which is leaning towards the truth. So the deluded truth would be more like doubt which leans to the untruth, which is that although one is not certain, 100% certain that karma doesn't work, deciding or thinking that it is most probably not true. The law of karma must be false, must not be true. Then the doubt which is in between is that, well, that it seems quite plausible. Karma could be true, could not be true. I'm not too certain. I'm still like, could be true or not be true. Although one is not certain yet, one is leading in the beginning, when one is in the middle of it. Then the doubt then starts to lean towards more, as more facts start to become apparent to oneself, then one would start having in mind an attitude where I'm still not 100% sure if this whole thing about karma is certain or not, whether it's true or not, but it seems most likely that it is true. Although I'm not certain, it is most likely it may be true. That is doubt leading to the truth, leaning towards the truth. Then from a state of mind of doubt, it is said then it will transcend into what is called a correct assumption. Then at that point, one is not 100% yet, one doesn't have the 100% conviction yet from one's own experience, But with all the reasonings and logicals, one has reached a state where karma is definitely true. Must be definitely true because of all the reasons and facts. It must, although if you ask me, do I know it in all detail? No, but I completely believe it is true. So having a correct belief, correct assumption or a correct belief means that one is beyond the doubt and really feels like this settles well with me. So the deluded doubt would be a doubt which is leaning towards something which is untrue and being quite adamant about that one, although it is leaning towards untruth, although it's not factual on what one is believing, kind of like being quite strongly convinced that it should be otherwise. I don't know if it's taken a lot of words for me to try to explain this, but I don't know if that makes some sense. Does it help to make it a little bit clearer?
Absolutely. And then
Okay.
I guess what I'm thinking is that when you're leaning more towards the truth and then become fully believing in the truth, that becomes right view?
Well, it's not, that would be, as I mentioned earlier, in the category of the states of mind, it would be called a correct assumption, a correct belief. So well, depending, if it is, yeah, it'll be, yeah, that is true. It'll be the right view. It'll be a correct view. But again, there are different levels of correct views. So it will say that the belief in karma, according to the teachings, is called a mundane right view. So it is a right view in as far as it is in as far as how things actually function. There's cause and effect, and things and everything evolves like that. But there's the view of reality goes even beyond that too. There's more subtleties on the view of reality. It is a correct view, but not the ultimate correct view, if I may put it that way. Is that food for thought?
Yes, definitely food for thought. Thank you.
Okay.
So you said mundane view or or ultimate view?
Sorry, what was that?
Are you referred to mundane view,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
ultimate view? Those are the two.
or we can say more like relative truth. Maybe I would say more, let's use the word relative truth and ultimate
and
truth.
ultimate. Okay.
So
okay.
the notion of karma is part of the relative truth. And then there's an ultimate truth. And having the correct view, the ultimate correct view would be in relation to having a correct view of the ultimate truth. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does.
It's
Thank
on some
you.
basis. Okay. So
Thank
anyone
you.
else, please, please raise your hand or unmute yourself. Any question is a valid question, by the way, because I believe that there's no such thing as a stupid question when someone is really interested in finding out about something. And in fact, what they think is a stupid question will be helping so many others to get some clarity as well. So any question is welcome.
Skylar, you can unmute, please.
Hi there. I was just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit, and maybe I'm sure it's one of those where it's like kind of specific to each individual, but I'm having a hard time, like my renunciation kind of turns into depression, and then my depression turns into renunciation. And it seems like it's this cycle thing that keeps going on, and I'm just not sure, like, I guess what I'm doing wrong, or just maybe if you...
Oh, thank you very much for that question. It relates very much to what I have been going through, also been struggling with as well. First of all, renunciation is a very hard one. Because to us beginners, renunciation sounds as if we have to renounce our pleasures, our normal pleasures, which we consider as being happiness. So no wonder we feel depressed when we think we have to give up our happiness, our pleasures. But as we understand the teaching, and as I understanding the teaching better, and just even quite recently, I read that phrase. That is, I mean, periodically I would have known that, but sometimes words are very powerful. So as one commentary on the teachings that I was reading recently emphasized this point that renunciation, what we're renouncing is suffering, not happiness. And of course, that takes a while for us to understand, because according to Buddhist teachings, what we perceive as pleasures are actually suffering in a disguise. It's called the suffering of change. So we perceive it as being pleasure initially, and no wonder we get attached to it, because we do have a momentary pleasurable feeling from it. But then because of our attachment, we want it to last, and it doesn't last. And then because it doesn't last, we get disappointed, we get, but because of that momentary pleasure we did experience, we think we'll get it again, and we just go after it again and again. So we are actually, according to the teachings, according to the great beings who see us, they see us as just pursuing other sources of suffering again and again. But so when we first hear about renunciation, we get this whole idea that, oh, I'm being asked to renounce my cup of coffee that I really love, or whatever it may be, that's maybe the mildest of the examples I'm using here. But we really take all of these scenarios where we think we have to give them up completely, and that can be depressive in our mind. So I think it will take time to really understand it. But actually, I totally relate to your question, because a couple of years ago, when I was in Melbourne translating for one of my teachers there, I had to confess to him at one point that, the reason why I find that I'm really struggling so much also, because when I talk about usually I talk about my identity crisis. Usually I started off with having an identity crisis between whether I'm an Easterner or a Westerner, because I'm Western born by European parents, but grew up in an Eastern country since I was, 5 years old. Naturally, so these cultural differences can be quite, culturally, they can even, it relates to our psychosis and ways of thinking. It can be quite, but when I started to go through this more and understand it more, I started to actually, when I did more inner search, I found that actually my real identity crisis, was not between East and West, but really between spirituality and materialism. I still have a lot of attachment to the material world. While I do appreciate the spiritual world, I wouldn't be here now, even presenting here, if I didn't have some sense of attraction to the spiritual world. But it seemed that they were opposing each other. When I wanted to be more spiritual, I felt I had to leave behind all the material world. And when I started, because of my attachment to the material world, the more I started to get immersed into it, I thought, I felt that I was being, how should we say, getting away from the spiritual world. So to finding that right balance is, of course, very difficult. It is about finding balance, I believe. And sometimes we feel we have found the balance. In fact, my depression started, one of the catalysts for my depression was when I thought I was seemingly in this perfect world between the spiritual, living in a perfect harmony between the spiritual and material world. And even when that collapsed, my ideal started to collapse, then I started to have, depression myself too. So yes, I totally understand that. But I think what we need to really understand is, of course, again, I might have to use Desmond Tutu's phrase here of like, we are human. we haven't developed renunciation yet. But I think let us begin by understanding what real renunciation means, to really remind ourselves that it's not about renouncing happiness. And even our pleasures, it is only, as our teacher says, Lama Yeshe says, one of my lay teachers, he says, you can still enjoy chocolate cake and a cup of coffee or whatever other enjoyments you have in life, but without being too attached to it. And I think that's where we get it wrong, was that as we seem to associate our pleasures and immediately start getting completely immersed into it and putting all our investment into it, all our energy into it, because we totally, again, believe this is a true source of happiness. So I think the main thing about renunciation is that if we can start to develop a mind of not putting complete trust in the sensual objects that we derive some pleasure from, to try to really recognize that they are not a true source of happiness. I might have not found yet the true source of happiness yet, but I believe that there is a true source of happiness within my teachers. The great beings are examples that they have found it. So working towards that slowly, gradually. And I think, to allow ourselves to still enjoy the things, small things we have in life, food, chocolate cake, whatever it may be, but not being too, I think we get into this neurotic state of mind of like, oh, I shouldn't, or it's all or nothing. But I think that all or nothing sort of perception we have about of life or anything is what causes us a little bit of a distress. I don't know if that relates to you or not. I was just sharing how I see it, and I don't know if that would relate to you or not, or if it makes some sense.
It does. I've had a little bit of experiences lately. Like I like to paint, but in a way I feel like it's basically just a pain diversion. Like I'm just trying to sidetrack myself, and like I could be, reading, my Dharma books, or doing puja or something, and not just painting. But then I'm like, oh, well, I'm practicing bodhicitta because I'm buying this material that somebody else is making. So I'm keeping them in business. And it's like almost like I'm justifying my pleasure. But then at the same point, I have to, hold myself back and be like, my favorite candle company just went out of business. And so me buying candles obviously didn't stop them going out of business. So now I have all this glass, candle holders, and I feel like I just wasted a whole bunch of stuff. So that's why it's like, it's so tricky trying to, be wholeheartedly honest with your intention of what you're trying to do, but the reality of what you can accomplish at the same time gets a little bit, it's like we're all here trying to be enlightened so that we can end samsara. But maybe we can't really, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. So I guess that's my cyclic thinking that I keep working.
No, I totally hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally understand the situation. And I think there's many aspects to it. I think one of the key things is that if we keep relating Dharma practice, spiritual practice, or in the Buddhist context called Dharma practice, as being something where we have to be sitting down serene, reading a text, or doing something which is traditionally presented as a practice, and only if that practice is only related and confined to doing that, then no wonder we get so distressed and all of that, and we completely kind of confused. But when we start to hear and understand the teachings on a broader level, we begin to understand that actually the Dhamma practice can be applied and relied on anything we're doing, as long as it's not actually destructive. Like a painting can be an offering. You can make that offering. They say that having food, we can collect the most merit. They say the Dhamma say by where every time we eat, we offer it before we eat. So then it becomes, we've actually done a practice there. So even, enjoying the food, imagining that we're offering food to the great beings within ourselves, like that. So actually we begin to recognize that everything we do there can be an element of practice of Dhamma. And the main thing I find that the most simplest way, although not easiest, the simplest though, way of defining between what is Dhamma and not, I feel in a very simple way, is whether one has a virtuous mind. And in any moment, if one has a positive mind, knowing that what one is doing in this moment is what one is best capable of doing. Even when one makes mistakes, acknowledging that, okay, well, I'm still a human, I would like to learn, and let me learn from this. So if we can try to turn around and use everything that we are doing as a way to enhance our understanding and try to maintain a positive mind. A positive mind is a virtuous mind, and that's what I feel is what Dharma is. Whereas even when we're doing something seemingly holy, meditating or prostrating or making offerings, I find myself sometimes the mind being so negative. So outside, someone may look at me and say like, oh, he's a great he's doing his meditation now, or he's doing his prayers, is great. But they don't see what's going in my mind. I'm creating negativity in my own mind. That's not a Dharma practice, as the Lamas adamantly say. Just having the physical appearance is not sufficient. That's not done in itself. It doesn't mean that we're doing a spiritual practice. Really on the mind again. So trying to maintain a virtuous mind and recognizing when our mind is not virtuous, and even recognizing that and using that, applying the teachings to understand that on its level and why that is so. So I think to really, what I like to remind myself again and again is where the Dalai Lama says that if we have become interested in doing some spiritual practice, the Dharma practice in this sense, and if it's been like if we begin to try to measure our progress in days or even weeks or even months, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. He says we have to look back years. It'll take years, and in fact, as we hear the stories of some of the great masters, is even lifetimes. So in one life, our progress, we have to really. The key word again here is to really be patient with ourselves and being patient. And it's easy to say, easier said than done. I have no doubt about that, but that seems to be the only way really, is to develop a little bit more patience. Does that make a bit sense? Okay. So again, anyone else, if you have any queries or want to share anything. I don't know how many there are online. I just see a few on my screen, but there might be others behind the scene. So, but if anyone is out there that I don't see. So I think, again, I've tried to cover these meanings of these verses in a very simple way. At least today, last week, I know I went through quite a bit of technical stuff, but just as a basis. But I think we've just covered these verses tonight in a very kind of like simplest way we can understand them. And I think what seems like far-fetched is whenever we feel like, oh, that's too much to be able to practice, it's like too outrageous. But if we can just acknowledging that we're not able to practice now is one thing. But that doesn't mean that we have to then completely say that, oh, this is invalid, this is insane way of practice, this is completely ridiculous. That will be completely another extreme. So I think to hold value the words and the practices while still acknowledging that one is not able to practice it fully right now. But I think when we hold the words, the meanings of what is being presented as being, sort of a valid source, then that already gives us an inspiration. You think, oh, well, may I be able to practice it that way? And so that's why each verse here ends with may I, not suggesting that actually the Dalai Lama, when he presents these teachings, he says there's another version of this text. The original version of this text, who the composer had composed, is that I will at all times hold them dear. I will hold others as supreme and so forth. But then he said later students actually finding that not everyone could develop that determination to actually do it right away, is put it down in a aspirational form, that may I be able to practice in such a, and that is more relatable to us, I think, right now, as we hear these great forms of practices. It may seem a little far-fetched, but if it sounds wonderful, then we could be aspired to it. And thus we make it as a prayer, may I hold them dear, as if I found a rare precious treasure, and so forth. Does that make a little bit more sense? Yeah. Okay, so I think in the last few minutes we have together, as there doesn't seem to be any further questions coming forth, and if you do have any, of course, things take time. We hear something, and it takes, even the form of questions, sometimes we need to think about it over a bit. So that is the process you will have for a week. A whole week you'll have a time to think about this and maybe reread it again and try to understand it. And then maybe next week you might have further questions after you have thought about it. So we can bring them back next week. So before we end the session for this session, let us just take a few moments to again go back into a more quiet and settled state of mind. So the Buddhist traditional way of gaining more wisdom as a way to overcoming our ignorance is said to be 3 specific stages. We gain a certain amount of wisdom just by hearing these teachings, advice. So we gain a certain amount of understanding and wisdom just by hearing them. But we further enhance that wisdom and understanding when we analyze and think about them ourselves. And then finally, we gain the real true wisdom, the primordial, real experiential wisdom when we put it into practice. So we are on the first step where we're hearing it, sharing it. But even this is really a great step. So, as we recall, we started the session in the morning with a most altruistic, positive motivation we could generate. And based on that positive motivation we generated right from the start, right from the beginning, it is said that all our activities, all our time that we've spent together for the last hour and a half has been definitely very meaningful. Meaningful in the sense of where we have created positive karma, what is also known as merit. Or in very simple terms, the deeds we did were noble deeds, good deeds. The time we spent had become worthwhile. So for every positive deed done from the teachings of karma, it leaves a positive imprint in our mind. And it is up to us what we want to do with this positive imprint in our mind. We can again, because it is something positive, we can gain those positive results just for ourselves, or we can dedicate it for the welfare of others. So here, as we all naturally want others to be happy as well. Yeah, we want to be happy ourselves, but yeah, once we are happy, it'll be boring if it is just oneself. If everyone else is suffering, it'll be hard to be really happy ourselves too. So why not others be happy as well and be free from suffering? So we dedicate our merits for this session to the actual real, genuine happiness and alleviation of suffering for all beings. And if I can do that by becoming enlightened myself, by becoming an enlightened being, then may the merits that I gain become a cause for my enlightenment so that I can help others to be free from all suffering and reach the ultimate state of happiness. So with this dedication in our mind, we can hold that dedication as like a beacon, like a lamp, like an inexhaustible beacon in our heart that we hold within ourselves at all time. We try to make our day, our life meaningful, day by day, moment by moment. And in that way, we can end our session for the morning. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having me all the way from Sweden. This is the easiest, quickest trip I've ever made to the States.
Thank you so much.